Hello and welcome to my multiple exposure and intentional camera movement course. This is an introduction to what we're going to cover on the course. So, a little bit of history first. Multiple exposure started in the 1860s with this sort of cute idea that it would be fun to create twins of people through double exposures. For example, so these were two exposures created at the same time, so without winding the film on. More of that later. And you can imagine in those days that those people had to stand very still for quite a period of time. So, in terms of film double exposure, there are two ways of doing it. This is the first. So you shoot an entire roll as normal. After the roll has been shot and wound up, you can pull out using a film leader retriever. Pull the film out again and reshoot the same film. This is known as double exposing it. However, the more common method is to do this, to double expose one frame at a time. So for example, you put one roll into your camera and take two images for every exposure, and then advance it to the next frame, and then do it again, two images, and advance it to the next frame. Theoretically, you can actually take more than two images as well, which I've got an example of in a moment. So here's an example of a double film exposure. This isn't one of mine. Looks like it's American to me, but it might not be. It might be Spanish for all I know. But you'll notice that how in the darker section where the silhouette of the man is apparent, that the other exposure is well exposed within it. So this is what happens in film, is the areas that are darker haven't been exposed, the film hasn't been exposed so much. And so they can take on more of the exposure of the other image that's layered. So here's an example of what I did very first time I tried multiple exposure using medium format film. So it's actually using a plastic Holga camera which takes 120 medium film format film. And this was actually 3 exposures. Now, if you know anything about that camera, you know that it only has one f-stop, f11, and it only shoots at one speed. I think it's about a 1/125th of a second. And it was quite dull that morning. So I knew that I had to take it more than one exposure to get any sort of reasonable exposure. So I calculated roughly that it would take 3 and tried not to move too much, just a little bit, and that's what's achieved this kind of ghostly effect. And I really love the colours involved as well, how the morning light is so blue. But now of course we've got digital cameras, and therefore 2 options. 1, we can use editing software such as Adobe Photoshop. 2, we can do the work in camera, and that is what this course is about. In camera multiple exposure. So that's combining between 2 and 9 images in one exposure. The number of images you choose to expose depends upon your camera's capacity and its ability and your choice, your creative choice. You can, each time you create an image, look at the composite image that you have created in camera as you're doing it and choose whether to keep or discard and do it again. So you can follow a creative exploration at an interesting location. And there are different modes of multiple exposure possible. More on that in a moment. And there are other creative options you can explore with your multiple exposure. These include white balance, defocusing the lens, and intentional camera movement. So, 3 inspiring multiple exposure artists to get you interested. Chris Friel, he's the first guy who got me interested in multiple exposure. And he was also kind enough to link to some of the articles I've written on multiple exposure on my website. And I really like his work. It does tend to be quite dark in tone. And this is probably one of the brightest images. But I really love the red. Very interesting. Valda Bailey, who's an artist, trained artist, and her work, I think, echoes that training. And Doug Chinnery. Doug and Valda work very closely together. And they do quite advanced training courses live, or they did before the lockdown. So yeah, very interesting. 3 artists well worth exploring. So, what are the different types of multiple exposure? Here are some photographic examples I've created. This is a standard average double exposure. Now some of you will have cameras that do this. That's 2 exposures taken in camera, and the light is divided equally between the 2 of them. Here then is a double exposure with an average again, but I've changed the white balance to quite an extreme setting and also included some intentional camera movement. More about all of these techniques on the course, of course. This is just to give you an idea of some of the potential things you can do. So this is a multiple exposure. I think it's 3 photos layered on top of each other using the bright multiple exposure mode choice. And then here is a multiple exposure using a dark mode choice and extreme white balance choices. I think, if I remember correctly, it's 4 frames. Interesting, eh? And then there's this one, which is similar in technique to the last one. Multiple exposure, dark mode choice, extreme white balances, but also includes a defocus lens and a wide aperture. That's why when compared to the previous shot, the edges are softer. And here's an example of a multiple exposure plus a mode choice that's dark plus some intentional camera movement on 1 or 2 of the exposures. So, you will know by now that not all digital cameras are equal. So let's just recap. Some have multiple exposure with 4 mode choices, the average, additive, bright and dark, that I'm going to go into on this course. They include the Canons 1DX, the 5Ds from Mark III and above, and the EOS R range. That's their advanced professional cameras really. And then most Nikon DSLRs and their Z series. And with Fuji, the X Pro 3 and the XT4. I won't be surprised to see the XT40 when they bring it out have the same facility. I use a Fuji XT4, having graduated from an XT2 that only had double exposure. Some cameras have multiple exposure but only 1 average mode, so you can do between 2 and 9 exposures on the Panasonic Olympus and Pentax, or some of those DSLRs. But you don't have the other modes. And then other older cameras only have double exposure and average mode. So, for example, like the Fuji X-T2. And I think the Canon 5D before the Mark III did the same as well. All Sony cameras have no multiple exposure function, which seems bizarre when you consider how advanced the rest of their features are. There is, however, an app available for most of their cameras that has got 6 modes. Now, I don't know anything about that, how effective it is and how easy it is to use. So this course, what, how and why are we going to cover? So we're going to look at the 4 modes, as I said: average, additive, bright and dark. We're going to look at white balance experimentation and experimenting with defocus lenses and wide apertures. We're also going to look at intentional camera movement and how that can be combined with multiple exposure. Now, in all cases, I'm going to share these ideas on location. So I'm actually at a place where I consider there's opportunity for creative exploration, and I'm going to then use examples of these techniques and share the images that are created at the same time. So that hopefully will be interesting for you. So a little bit more about intentional camera movement. It's a slow shutter speed plus a handheld or tripod movement. A couple of examples. Here's a handheld one, which I converted to black and white because it was a very drab white and black day, and this image of trees was created with slight movement up and down. And then this one was created on a tripod, which is very slow shutter release and sweeping, panning the camera on its tripod from left to right. I actually did it more than once. I probably did it 2 or 3 times. And if you look very carefully, the top left-hand side on the horizon, you can see almost an echo of the coast that is available from one of the panned areas. But beautiful colours, yeah? So, why use multiple exposure and intentional camera movement? Why bother? So there may be 3 reasons. Before the 3 reasons, I forgot. Primarily, when we use them, we're going to create abstract photography. What we create will be a little bit difficult to identify what it is. Why bother with that? So abstract concentrates on shape, form, colour, line and texture, sometimes pattern too, and often the viewer will be left wondering what the original object was. Abstract photography is not about the literal view. It will introduce the viewer to the emotional link, what the photographer had felt with the object or subject at the time. The idea is to share an emotional connection. So when you look or engage with abstract photography, you're meant to enjoy the way the photo makes you feel. It's more about the feelings that the photo generates than recognising the original subject. Of course, we try to do that as well. Creating abstract images is a work of imagination and emotional connection. More of that later on the course. Here's an example. I was experiencing strong emotion on this day. I'd just been listening to contrary government advice about whether I was allowed to go to work, not go to work, go out, not go out, during the first lockdown in March 2020. I was very confused and frustrated. This is an attempt of me to convey that feeling. So the grid, which is actually intentional camera movement on the bark of a tree, is to suggest that not being able to get through what's going on, what am I meant to think? But that there is a path there is the other image, but it's obscured slightly. So the colours have not been changed in any way. In fact, nothing has been altered in any way, apart from a slight light adjustment, exposure adjustment. That's it. The colours are created in camera. This is one of the magic bits of multiple exposure. Something that you can be surprised and excited by when you look at what you've created. So, the three main reasons I promised to do multiple exposure and ICM, I think they are these. Firstly, it's interesting, isn't it, to develop your own techniques, to learn something new, to explore a different photographic technique. As I mentioned, you can, with these techniques, explore your creativity. You see what you can actually create with your camera, in camera, on location. And finally, you've got the possibility of sharing an emotional connection with your audience. This is going to be the focus of what we do. We're looking at the technique, we're looking at creatively exploring those techniques, and we're looking at communicating how we feel about things. However, a warning, this photo you saw earlier, there is something called the Pollyanna principle, which means that we get attracted by things we feel positive about, excited, and we tend to then do more of those things. This can take us away from what we're actually creating. Take a breath, come back, look at what you've created. Yes, sure, the photo is bright, cheery and interesting, but does it have any purpose? It didn't really. It was just exploring technique. So there's going to be some stages you go through. You're going to explore your technique, and in that, discover some things you really like. Hold on to those, but don't get carried away. Just notice that you're very excited. So the course focus will follow 4 things that we've kind of said already. The technical skills, having a creative mindset, looking at what you're doing mindfully, and being attuned to how what you're creating makes you feel, or indeed how you feel whilst you're creating them. Slightly different. And finally, creative photos that explore your life experience, so that you can share how you feel and process some of those feelings you're experiencing. Okay, I look forward to seeing your photos on the course, and that's all for now. Bye bye.